Well, it's Veterans Day. A happy Veterans Day to all who have taken up the uniform in defense of this amazing country. We're going to get into conversation momentarily with retired U.S. Navy Commander Kirk Lippold about his own service and thoughts on Veterans Day. Also, looks like the shutdown really is ending. This actually is it. We're allowed to leave our homes. This really is the big deal, guys. An update for you on the shutdown and the ensuing Democrat Civil War. All of that and more in today's episode of The Josh Hammer Show. November 11th. Every year, we celebrate this as Veterans Day here in the United States. We celebrate it because once upon a time, it was known as Armistice Day, November 11th. Specifically, it was November 11th, 1918. That was the beginning of the end of what was then known as the Great War. It wasn't known as World War I because there was no World War II yet. Kind of reminds me of the old Mel Gibson film, History of the World, Part 1. Implies there's a History of the World, Part 2, but neither here nor there. So the Great War, aka World War I, has its armistice. On November 11th, 1918, the Treaty of Versailles, an infamously flawed treaty, is not signed until about a year later. The specific reasons and details for the failures of the Treaty of Versailles and Woodrow Wilson's own role in that is neither here nor there for present purposes. But November 11th, ever since then, has been honored here in the United States as Veterans Day. Interestingly, for the British and for many other European countries, this is their Remembrance Day. This is their equivalent of Memorial Day. But here in the United States, we already had our Memorial Day, so this is now our Veterans Day. They are separate things. More on that in just a second, but if you haven't done so already, folks, and this is a really heartfelt plea here. Many of you know veterans. Some of you are veterans. Thank you. God bless you, really. God bless you for your service. And for those of you who know veterans, you should say that. You should communicate your gratitude. This country would not exist were it not for the brave men and women who pick up their uniforms in service of our people, our customs, our folkways, our constitution, our principles, our way of life, our home and hearth, our homeland. That's why we're here. It is an amazing thing that America is the first-rate superpower that it is, while having an all-volunteer military. Sure, you have the selective service, and there was the draft during Vietnam. That has been really, really rare throughout our history. We have had a volunteer military for most of our history. Don't take that for granted. Really, go ahead and please, and make sure to go ahead and thank a veteran today if you have not already done so. President Donald Trump, as he did during his first term, and he is doing now again during the first Veterans Day of his second term, Donald Trump visiting Arlington National Cemetery. Here he was, for instance, at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. You see Vice President J.D. Vance there by President Trump's side. J.D. Vance, a Marine Corps veteran. So thank you, Mr. Vice President, for your service as well. Veterans Day also marks the 250th anniversary of the United States Marine Corps, an anniversary that quite literally predates the United States itself, going all the way back to the year 1775 during the days of the Continental Congress. There are a few things to say about the present composition of the U.S. military, and have another thing to say as well about the current contretemps of the Republic as pertains to military matters. On the former point, Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, formerly Secretary of Defense, now Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, has done yeoman's work just in his first year in turning around our military recruitment crisis. He really has. One of the reasons why Secretary Hegseth was chosen for that role, one of the reasons why in a personal capacity I so robustly and vociferously supported his nomination going back to the transition period, recall there were a lot of Republican senators who were not necessarily on board with a Secretary of Defense / War Hegseth. Joni Ernst of Iowa comes to mind. There were a lot of naysayers, a lot of pushback. But the reason that I was so gung-ho about Hegseth is that he is in touch with younger veterans. He is in touch with younger Americans more generally. He has served in numerous of America's post-9/11 global war on terror operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. And the numbers bear that out. The numbers thus far, from January 2025 through Veterans Day 2025, do bear out something of the beginning of a real turnaround in America's military recruitment numbers across the branches. That is an amazing thing, and do not take that for granted either. It should be pretty simple. If you want to inspire young men and women to take up arms and to risk it all, to put it all on the line to defend you and me and our great country and our way of life, you should make sure they understand that they are valued. You should not subject them, as Mark White Rage Milley infamously did, to an Ibram X. Kendi seminar on anti-racism or critical race theory, which were, yes, the actual required readings around that time of the Great Awakening, the George Floyd summer into the early Biden administration in those years. You should make sure that there are not overly crippling, overly hamstringing rules of engagement for our active duty service members. The kind of things that the Obama administration put it back in place a decade ago or so. Hegseth has already started to turn that ship around. And that is to his tremendous, tremendous credit. God willing, those trends will only continue for many months, indeed for many years, perhaps even many decades to come. Another thing that must be said about Veterans Day at this exact moment. As I said, we have Veterans Day on the day where the Europeans, the British, and the Western Europeans celebrate their Remembrance Day, because we already have our Memorial Day. Well, why do we already have our Memorial Day in late May every year? Because by definition, it predates Armistice Day in World War I. In fact, Memorial Day goes back to memorializing the Civil War. Those who died during the Civil War, the horrific, horrific internecine conflict in the mid-19th century. To this day, if you look at the casualty statistics for Americans who have died taking up arms for their country in the history of the Republic, going back to the Revolutionary War, going back to Lexington and Concord, to Paul Revere's Midnight Ride, you go back all the way to those origins and you look war by war, how many Americans have actually paid the ultimate price, have given the ultimate sacrifice by theater, by conflict. What you will see is that, and these are estimates, but the historians have gotten pretty good at this. The Civil War dead, estimate to be 620,000. The World War II dead, little over 405,000. World War I rounds up to 117,000. Everything else then is less and less from there. So World War II is a massive number, but even with World War II being a massive number, the war to end all wars, that's what they said about World War I actually, then World War II takes that even further. The point I'm making is this. The casualty figures for the American Civil War to this day are still more than all other conflicts combined. World War II, World War I, Vietnam, Korea, you name it. All of them. The War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, all of them. I think that is an instructive point, given today's incredibly acrimonious, bitter online environment. There is a lot of chatter increasingly on both sides, about whether or not this republic can endure. Heck, I've raised those questions myself, in the aftermath especially of the assassination of our friend Charlie Kirk. If political violence ends up exacerbating even further, when we lose the ability to settle our differences at the ballot box, with the keyboard, with the pen, and instead take up knives and swords and bullets and rifles, that really could be the end. That could be the end of the republic if you can keep it. And there are a lot of folks who cynically are trying to expedite that unraveling. They're trying to immanentize the eschaton to an extent, if you will, the eschaton of this country. They want a civil war. They want a great unraveling. They want a national divorce, they sometimes call it. Don't let that happen. Look at those numbers. More Americans dead in the Civil War than all other conflicts combined. On a day like today, on Veterans Day, think about that for a second. Do what you can to keep this country together. Do what you can to not take us down that utterly horrific rabbit hole. Well, as mentioned, we are just delighted to bring on to the show Navy Commander Kirk Lippold, who, among other hats that he has worn and currently wears, is that he was the commanding officer on the USS Cole back in the year 2000 at the time of that horrific Al-Qaeda terrorist attack. I'm old enough to remember it in person. I'm sure some of our younger audience members might not even remember it, but in any event, Commander Lippold, thank you so much for joining the Josh Hammer Show, especially on a day like today on Veterans Day. Happy Veterans Day. Thank you for your service, and thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you, Josh. It's wonderful to be on the show, and thank you for all your listeners who support those young men and women who choose a life of consequence serving our nation to defend our freedom.
It is genuinely our honor, and I say that with every morsel of sincerity. So let's begin by talking about the USS Cole. I was young. I was in elementary school, or maybe middle school. I can't remember exactly how old I was, but I remember it very well. I was definitely old enough where it resonated with me. It struck a chord with me. But I think that there are some younger listeners and viewers of the show who don't remember it or probably barely remember it at all. Maybe they've read an article about it. They've skimmed the Wikipedia page. Take us back. Take us back to that day, and why don't you just briefly tell us about your experience? This is obviously a horrific attack, one of the worst attacks on a naval vessel in the history of the United States. You were there. Why don't you just tell us what you remember about that day?
Well, Josh, I'll be honest with you. The attack on USS Cole was the last major terrorist event prior to 9/11. USS Cole was on a deployment. We were headed to the Middle East to enforce United Nations sanctions against the country of Iraq. We pulled into that port that morning for a brief stop for fuel, expected to take on around 250,000 gallons for about 6 to 8 hours. And as part of routine harbor operations, we contracted for 3 garbage barges to take off trash, plastic, and hazmat. 2 boats came out, 2 left, 3rd boat came out. What we didn't know that morning is that Al-Qaeda had been there for over a year watching Navy ships. They had brought a boat in from Saudi Arabia that looked just like the garbage barges. It masqueraded as one, which is how it got in. We thought it was the garbage barge. Came to the middle of the ship, and something the Navy had never trained for or anticipated. It was a waterborne explosive device, 2 suicide bombers that detonated, blowing a 40 by 40 foot hole in the side of the ship. And when that happened, power failed, lights went out, and the crew, the announcing system had failed, and the crew fell back on their training. Without anyone able to tell them what had happened, where to go, what to do, they were able to get that ship stable in a little over an hour. That first day, we evacuated 33 wounded off the ship in 99 minutes, and of those 33, 32 had survived. Tragically, 17 sailors were killed and 37 wounded. But truly, it was a remarkable event that showed the resiliency of the crew, the effectiveness of what you get when you train your crew properly. And it really stands as a hallmark even today for the United States Navy. Unfortunately, 2 administrations, both the Clinton and Bush administrations, did nothing in response to the attack. It infuriated bin Laden. And unfortunately, 11 months later, the 9/11 attacks took place.
Well, what exactly was he was Bin Laden so infuriated about? You're saying that he was infuriated that they essentially ignored him? Is that what you're saying?
It is. He expected the United States to respond. You got to remember, he was conducting terrorist attack. 2 years before the attack on Cole, he had conducted the bombings against our embassies in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, Nairobi, Kenya. There was really no effective response to that. There had been the World Trade Center 1 bombing in 1993, and essentially an arrest and a trial, but no real response by the United States. He wanted to initiate the global jihad with al-Qaeda as the base from which they could take on these nations. He wanted the United States entirely out of the Middle East and especially the Arabian Peninsula. And he had hoped by conducting these attacks, the latest of which was USS Cole, it would initiate that global jihad and allow him to recruit people to come into al-Qaeda and fight the evil nation, United States, and our allies.
Absolutely, absolutely fascinating. So Kirk Lippold is a former U.S. Navy commander. He's now retired. He was the commanding officer on the USS Cole during that horrific strike by al-Qaeda back in the year 2000. Commander Lippold, my understanding is that you're now very active in the veteran charities world. So, and this is a perfect day to talk about veteran charities. It is Veterans Day, November 11th. Celebrate here as Veterans Day in Western Europe as Armistice Day or Remembrance Day. But my understanding is that you have some pretty grave concerns about misuse and fraud within the broader orbit when it comes to organizations and NGOs for veterans charities. So what specifically have you observed? Because this is a pretty perfect day, I would think, to try to sound the alarm and get the message out as to what that fraud is. It seems to me that this is really playing with fire. I mean, we want our veterans, both people, to make sure they get everything they need. So what have you observed in your years of being active in this space, and what can we do to fix this apparent fraud problem?
Well, Josh, what I did is following retirement, wanted to find a way to give back. I was approached by the organization charities4vets.org, and they basically, what they do is they take the top 100 veterans charity organizations. Now, as a lot of people may not know, every nonprofit, 501c3, has to make their tax returns public. Charities for Vets goes through all of those tax returns to really discern, where does your hard-earned money go? When you get tugged at your heartstrings watching these ads on TVs or in print media, they look at it and say, that looks like a great organization. But when you really pull the string and you find out what money does truly get to the veteran, what Charities for Vets does is we do the homework for people. So that if you go on our website, you will find 3 categories regarding really the top 100 veterans charity organizations. Highly recommended that 90% or more of your dollars that you give actually gets to a veteran. If you're in the recommended category, that means 75% or more actually gets to those organizations. And if you're less than that, we don't really care. We have a gold standard and it's hard and fast. And we will put you in the not recommended category. And really that comes from you have too much admin that gets sucked up, too much fundraising, or you have too much in assets, billions of dollars in assets that you keep in a trust fund for investments rather than actually getting to veterans. And what we want to do is twofold. One, let people see where the good organizations are in the recommended and highly recommended category to redirect their giving dollars. A lot of these organizations, while they're in the not recommended category, may do great work. But here's the other piece. We want them to improve their operations, to be more efficient, to be more effective, and to get more money to the veterans themselves.
Do you think that the United States more generally, both from a government perspective and from a private sector, just civilian perspective, are we doing enough to support our veterans? Because the strong sense that I get is that we are not. But I'd be curious if you share that sentiment and specifically what we, both in the public sector and the private sector, can be doing to better support them right now.
I think when it comes to veterans, it's a very fine line. I think that there have been a number of issues pointed out over the last few years regarding the Veterans Administration and how we take care of those veterans who truly need help, whether it's because of physical disabilities that have been incurred as far as fighting and combat injuries, or whether it's those mental illness issues, plus those veterans that are served they get that care that they can go to VA facilities and get health care and other things. I think what a lot of people are familiar with is home mortgage loans. So the United States as a nation truly does a lot for its veterans. But like any large bureaucracy, there are seams in there where for the long term, a lot of time the VA doesn't have the ability or the funding to take care of them. And that's truly where these veterans organizations and charities step up to fill that gap. And that truly is the American people who recognize the service and sacrifice of our veterans, who choose that life of consequence, serve in harm's way, and oftentimes pay a tragic price for that we can reach out and try to take care of them for the long term, whereas a government we can't. It also bonds communities together. Every community in our country has veterans that have served. How you take care of those veterans and what you do and how you recognize their service could truly make a difference. And Charities for Vets says, hey, these are the organizations that you can look to within your own community to help those veterans who have served, sacrificed, and just need a little bit of help that the government can't or afford to provide.
And one more time, the URL is charitiesforvets.org?
Yes, that's exactly it, charitiesforvets.org. And again, when you go on there, just to give you an idea, and we accept donations as well, to give you an idea of how well ours are put forth, we're all volunteers. A $50 donation allows us to reach 1,000 more people to inform us about our organization and what we do. So every dollar counts not only for the charities, but for us as well.
Okay, very good. Well, there you have it, folks. Charitiesforvets.org, one of the best ways to ensure that your hard-earned taxpayer dollars are actually going to support this most important of causes. So, Navy Commander Kirk Lippold, we thank you for your service. We thank you for your leadership on that horrific day back in the year 2000 in the Gulf. And we thank you for all that you are currently doing on behalf of all of the amazing men and women who have taken up arms and put it all on the line to serve their country, to defend all of us, and to defend our way of life. So God bless you. Happy Veterans Day. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for joining the Josh Hammer Show today.
Thank you, Josh. Much appreciation. Thank you to all your listeners who support those young men and women who serve.
Well, in non-Veterans Day related news, it looks like the shutdown is actually here to end. What do you know? We covered it at length on yesterday's show, but another procedural vote in the United States Senate on Monday evening. The same Democrats plus Angus King of Maine, who was technically independent, he caucuses with the Democrats. So the same 8 Democratic caucus goers, for lack of a better description, they joined the Republicans in order to cast this procedural vote to actually end this shutdown. So it's just a question as to when Speaker Mike Johnson brings this thing to a vote over in the House. Based on all that I can tell, that vote might happen as soon as tomorrow. Unlikely to be on the rest of today, but I suppose we shall see. Notably, Hakeem Jeffries is dead set against it. Hakeem Jeffries is the Democrat leader in the House, and he is probably going to be able to rally up probably his entire caucus, if I had to guess, because the Democrats in the House just not the same as some of these Democrats over in the Senate. To an extent, that kind of goes on both sides. As someone who spent a lot of time over on Capitol Hill over the past 10 years, give or take, for various things, there really is, and for those who don't live in Washington or have never worked in Washington, I can't emphasize the point enough, there is a huge difference between the House and the Senate in really many ways, but just the general temperament, the general climate in the House and the Senate is massively different. The U.S. House is very much the wild, wild west. You have guys who are able to campaign out of their pickup truck. I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but they catch a wind. They get a great endorsement from the local sheriff, whatever there. They get into Congress, and they sometimes say a lot of crazy stuff. Not always, but sometimes. Marjorie Taylor Greene, who most recently was spotted on the Tucker Carlson show, or commenting on the Tucker Carlson show yesterday about how amazing chemtrails are, well, that's a good example as to the kind of crazy crap that sometimes manages to find its way into the U.S. House. The U.S. Senate, by contrast, is very much a more subdued, sober, mature, country club type institution. Now, that's both a good and a bad thing. I'm not saying that is unambiguously a good thing. There's a lot about the wild, wild west style of the House that is actually quite nice and is more on the cutting edge, perhaps, that is arguably more in touch with the voter sentiments. I'm speaking here in very broad terms, by the way. There obviously are going to be some congressmen that are more subdued, some senators that are more fiery. You get the idea. We're talking here in very broad, macro level, more abstract terms. But for present purposes, all I'm saying is that this is how you can interpret the fact that there are 7 Democrats plus the independent Angus King that crossed the aisle to vote Republicans to end the shutdown, whereas in the House, I think that Speaker Johnson would be remiss if he could count on really any Democrats. I mean, maybe you'll find 1 or 2 in the Problem Solvers Caucus. I mean, like literally like the last 1 or 2 so-called blue dog moderate Democrats. We talk about a dying breed if there ever were one. So Johnson's going to have to make sure he has his votes lined up like a duck in the row. And I could easily see someone like a Thomas Massie, who I really, really hope loses his next primary election to his Trump-endorsed primary opponent. I can't stand that guy, and I certainly hope that he retires back to his Kentucky farm whence he belongs. But I could easily see a world in which a Thomas Massie does not vote for this deal. Why? Well, if we're being candid, there's actually a smidgen of logic and reasoning behind that. This deal is not perfect. It is mostly a massive loss for Democrats, which is why Democrats are just totally up in arms about it there. But it's not the best deal in the world. They are agreeing to give back pay and to rehire all of these furloughed workers for the past month and a half now, since October 1st. So I could easily see that happening, but it looks like the government is going to reopen. And from a travel perspective, if nothing else, with these thousands of canceled flights, these stories I'm hearing from friends and family members who are having their flights stranded with the Thanksgiving holiday coming up, it really could not happen. Frankly, it really should not have gone on for another day, especially with November 15th. In just 4 days is the deadline that I've seen for the accounting gimmicks at the Department of War to expire and for troops to go unpaid. That would have been a disaster in and of itself as well. So this really couldn't have gone on any further. At this point, it is enough of a win for Republicans, enough of a win for Team Sanity, where I think that you and the audience ought to be generally happy, if not quite enthusiastic about this there. Democrats, as I said, they are just totally melting down about this. A fascinating interaction on CNN. Let's go ahead and watch this between the inestimable Scott Jennings, our colleague on the Salem Podcast Network. Scott Jennings got into a little bit with Jim Clyburn of South Carolina. Go ahead and watch this.
Do you believe as a member of Congress, a judge can compel the executive to spend money that you haven't appropriated?
Yes, I do.
Oh.
Yes, I do.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought we didn't want kings.
Nobody
Maybe we need king for a day. What do we need? I mean, that is literally a king, spending money that is not appropriated.
Judge is not a king.
No, you're turning the president into one if he can spend without appropriation.
Well, now, if you got a rainy day fund, it was appropriated at one time. The fund didn't come out of the air. The money is sitting there. Now, they didn't appropriate it yesterday or the day before, but the money was appropriated last year sometime, and the rainy day fund was there for this purpose.
All right, so he's talking about this SNAP funding dispute. So a lower court judge, one of these lower court judicial insurrectionist radicals, had put a temporary injunction, a nationwide injunction to the Trump administration and joining them, prohibiting them from ending the partial withdrawal of SNAP funds. Only a partial withdrawal, by the way. They had reduced the payments to about 60 or 65% of payments. Lower court judge says you can't do that, fund the whole thing. The money will just fall from the sky or whatever. However this works in Looney Tunes, Bernie Sanders economics land. And then it was actually Ketanji Brown Jackson at the U.S. Supreme Court that said, no. It was literally the leftmost member, the most cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs member of the entire U.S. Supreme Court, a woman so utterly stupid that at her own U.S. Senate Judiciary confirmation hearing, she literally could not define what a woman is in Matt Walsh documentary parody fashion. It was that utter dolt who said, no, even this ruling is actually too crazy for me, and therefore she overturned or put a stay on the lower court nationwide injunction. Jim Clyburn apparently is to the left of Ketanji Brown Jackson because he is saying that no, a judge actually can tell the Congress, his own purported branch. What happened to the good old-fashioned day of separation of powers? What happened to James Madison writing back in the Federalist number 51, talking about the separation of powers construct, this Article 1, Article 2, Article 3 tripartite system? Madison writing about how if men were angels, government would not be necessary to control them. But men are not angels. Men are fallen. We know that. Both Judaism and Christianity preach that. Therefore, writes Madison. Ambition must be made to counteract ambition. That clip from Jim Clyburn, how far removed is that from the Madisonian ambition counteracting ambition construct? This dude's just rolling over. He's rolling over in supine fashion. Oh, give it to me, Judge. Give it to me. Just tell me what to do. I am at your mercy, Judge. That's not our system. But that is definitely who the Democrats are. Most Democrats, by the way, other than these 8 senators, as I mentioned, are really, really unhappy about this. Let's actually go back to CNN. Democratic Congressman Jake Auchincloss of Massachusetts, not a happy camper. Let's go ahead and watch this.
I think a year out trying to play politics with these shutdown votes is losing the plot. The electorate has been crystal clear about what they care about, and that's higher prices, affordability across the board. And the electorate knows who to blame for the affordability crisis in this economy. It's Donald Trump and it's MAGA Republicans who are fixated on designing a golden ballroom at the same time as they're trying to deprive paychecks for air traffic controllers. I mean, these folks have just totally lost the plot here. But Democrats can't just sit back and point fingers. What voters want to hear is, what's your plan? What's your plan on housing? What's your plan on healthcare? What's your plan on energy? And that is what we need to be putting forward. That's what I have been putting forward and what we need to deliver on after the midterms.
And he would continue on CNN as well, talking about how Democrats, they just caved. They capitulated. Watch this.
It's not even good. I mean, there's no perfect and good here. It's caving. And not a single win was delivered for the middle class. The middle class was very clear in 2024 when Donald Trump won his election, and very clear again this week in the New Jersey and Virginia and Georgia and New York elections, that affordability is the mandate. If you are a politician, you either lower prices or you perish. And so before this shutdown happened, along with other members of the House, I laid out a series of ways that we might lower prices for the middle class. It was reversing the worst of the Medicaid cuts. It was a vote on the tariffs to rescind some of these inflationary measures. And none of it got done. And as Democrats look forward to January, when we're going to be doing this whole rodeo all over again, we had better have a strategy that we can deliver on for the middle class, because voters want to see politicians get stuff done to lower prices.
So there's a kernel of truth certainly in that answer. I am firmly of the opinion that voters do want to see politicians act more rapidly to get cost of living in a more affordable place there, to tame inflation. This is a whole column that I wrote on Friday, my syndicated column, which you can find on Newsweek, LA Times, Real Clear Politics, and elsewhere, where I wrote, it's still the economy, stupid. So there is a kernel of truth, definitely, and far be it from me to give the Democrats any credit, but there's a kernel of truth to what he is saying there, and certainly the sooner that Republican leaders from the White House to the Congress realize that, the better off it will be for the midterm elections next fall. Now, that has really nothing to do whatsoever with the current fight. I mean, what I just said has nothing to do, this is the category error, the logical error that Auchincloss, the Massachusetts congressman, is making, is that what I just said has nothing to do with what they just allegedly shut down the government over. I mean, why did you guys shut this down again? Like, literally, what was the point of this? We all knew you were going to cave. The proof was there from the beginning. You didn't have the numbers. You're a minority in the Senate, you're a minority in the House, you don't control the White House, and your messaging totally stinks. The American people had no clue what the heck you were asking for. Yeah, we kind of sort of knew it was for healthcare subsidies. Beyond that, no one knew. It wasn't like there are, today's Veterans Day, it wasn't like there were veterans dying in the street and they're shutting down the government to give the veterans life-saving health care. No, it was like a more abstract thing about healthcare premiums that, oh, by the way, are disproportionately set to go up in blue states where the federal government has taken over the health insurance marketplace. But the Auchincloss wing of the Democratic Party, you want to go even further, the crazy cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs wing, the AOC, Ilhan Omar, Jasmine Crockett wing, you know, the 75 IQ wing of the Democratic Party, well, they're talking about how Chuck Schumer is a disaster, and he's got to go, the traitor that he is. Well, Schumer's probably going to have a feisty primary challenge from AOC, the wise Latina, or someone of that sort in the upcoming Senate primary there. More generally, this shutdown, these shenanigans, especially coming right on the heels of the Democrat electoral success in the off-year elections last Tuesday, including the victory of the Marxist radical Zohran Mamdani in New York City, all of this is only going to exacerbate the already well underway Democrat civil war. The civil war is here. It's not going anywhere. Now, the right is having its own conversation right now about the Tucker or the Fuentes stuff. Where do we draw the line? What is part of the coalition? What is not part of the coalition? We're going to have Bruce Pearl, former Auburn University men's basketball coach, on the show tomorrow. We will get into all of that with Coach Pearl. But that's not quite the same thing as the ferocity of what I see as this civil war fight on the left. Between the folks who interpreted the Kamala Harris shellacking in 2024, between the folks who correctly interpreted that as a rebuke of contemporary wokeism, of far-left progressive radicalism, of leftist identity politics, leftist illiberalism more generally. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have the folks now that see Mamdani get elected in New York City, and they say, oh, that's going to win across the country. And now they see Schumer capitulating, and they're right, he did capitulate. They didn't get a darn thing out of this. Literally, Mike Johnson in the House is not even promising a vote on the expiring Obamacare subsidies. They got zilch, nothing, nada. It's an astounding capitulation on the one hand, and on the other hand, it was eminently predictable. So you have this, and it's riling them up there. I will just say this, to the folks who actually think, to the folks who are genuinely impassioned on the left, from the Mamdani mayoral victory, and are now just getting all excited based on this Schumer capitulation, y'all go ahead and run Zohran Mamdani-like candidates across the country. You run those kind of people in Georgia, in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona. Go ahead and even run that kind of candidate in light blue cities in red states. See how that might play out in a Houston, Texas, a Kansas City, Missouri, something like that. It's not going to work out for you very well. The media barely covers this, by the way. The media is utterly obsessed with all the sniping on the right. And that's all fun and games to an extent, but they really would do themselves a favor to cover what is happening on the left, because this civil war is only going to get orders and orders of magnitude more heated and more fiery from here. Final note before we close today's show. I flagged on Friday's show that I was going to revisit this topic, and I want to revisit this. And this is the issue of the 10 Commandments litigation down in the states of Louisiana and Texas pertaining to the notion of so-called separation of church and state. So there were separate cases out of Texas and Louisiana pertaining to requirements to post 10 Commandments in the classrooms. Texas, Louisiana, and Mississippi are the three states that are parts of the federal appeals court and the federal judiciary known as the Fifth Circuit. I know it because I clerked on it. And what they've done, the Fifth Circuit, is they've consolidated these two cases, and they will hear the oral argument coming up here in just a couple months in January. This is a conservative court. If there is any lower court that you would want to have this sort of litigation on that could most start to tear down the deeply flawed edifice of this country's absurd separation of church and state jurisprudence, you might get a decent ruling here. Now, the way this works is you have a 3-judge panel. If the case is particularly close or interesting, then you could have a subjective discretionary vote to grant what lawyers call en banc review, where you get all the active judges, in this case it's 17 judges on the Fifth Circuit, to go ahead and review the case from the 3-judge panel on the merits. It's impossible, frankly, to predict that. It may happen, it may not happen. So the big question now is, who are the 3 judges? But if hypothetically, and again, this is a right of center court firmly, unequivocally, if you actually get some solid conservative judges on that court, you could get a pretty fun opinion here. And the basic way that opinion would be fun is that it would say this. It would question the entire notion of so-called separation of church and state. It would correctly note that the very notion of separation of church and state comes from this 233-word letter that Thomas Jefferson wrote in 1802 to the Baptist of Danbury, Connecticut. He wrote it in a political context. He was actually just trying to peel away support from the New England clergy from his partisan rival, the Federalist Party, the party of John Adams, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton. So Jefferson, trying to write to them to politically peel away, writes how the First Amendment effectuates a wall of separation. That's his phrase, wall of separation between church and state. Well, first of all, it really doesn't. What it actually says that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. Okay, fair enough. Congress can't do that. You know who could? The states. How do I know? Because they literally did it. They literally did it for decades and decades after the founding. Massachusetts, one of the most far-left states in the country today, had an established church as late as the 1830s, 4.5 decades after the Constitution was ratified. Their established church there was Congregationalism. Any number of other states had this arrangement as well. The purpose is that it was supposed to be a federalism provision to allow various states, localities, if they're so interested, to have some sort of official church, some sort of official religion, subject to the religious freedom requirements of the First Amendment. You can't compel someone to violate his conscience, etc., etc. But there, within that very important caveat, and it's a crucial caveat, I'm an observant Jew, I know it as well, within that important caveat, you could have an established church. That's the basic compromise there. Nonetheless, there's been just horrific Supreme Court precedents on this topic. They've started to peel away at it a little bit in recent years. There was a very good case out of Washington State, the Coach Kennedy case, that my old friends at First Liberty Institute, they were the lawyers. They did a fantastic job. This is the case out of Washington State. The praying coach who would pray with his players on the 50-yard line there. The Supreme Court ended up saying that's perfectly okay. This is not a First Amendment violation. They ended up formally overruling this ridiculous 1970s case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, which was it's not worth getting into the details there, but a very bad case there. Ultimately, what has to happen, and I wrote this along with my two co-authors, Yoram Hazony and Timon Klein, in a law review essay a few months ago, actually. We argue that what has to happen is that there's a case from 1947 called Everson versus Board of Education. That was the first time that the United States Supreme Court ever adopted into its jurisprudence this Jeffersonian language from this 1802 letter of a wall of separation between church and state. So for 145 years, between 1802 and 1947, it wasn't part of our law. I mean, ask someone today, is separation of church and state a thing? They would say, oh yeah, of course. For 145 years, way more than half this country's history, it literally was not a thing. So if you want to get to the source, and something like that has to happen to embolden God and Bible and Scripture more in the public square, get the Ten Commandments hanging on the school classrooms, get an ecumenical school prayer back in schools. That's the case from the 1960s called Engel versus Vitale. But this case Everson out of New Jersey from 1947 is the origin of the problems here. That's what has to happen. I would love nothing more than to see this consolidated case in the Fifth Circuit with a conservative panel, if they get it, if they're so lucky, to take a shot at Everson, to say that this is dubious at best and is outright historically erroneous and wrong at worst. That would really make my day. We'll see what panel they get. It's literally done by a random number generator at the courthouse in New Orleans, Louisiana. I kid you not, that's literally how it happens. So there's no way of knowing which judges get assigned to this panel, but we'll see. I have a sneaking suspicion we actually might be in for a good surprise in this case. We are definitely going to keep our eyes closely on this one here on the Josh Hammer Show. But for now, thank you as always for tuning in. We hope you are able to thank a veteran today. To the veterans currently watching the show, God bless you. Thank you for your service. Hope you have a great, happy Veterans Day. You've been watching the Josh Hammer Show.